Hello Internet, it's Matt here for the Dork Lords. If you're new to the channel, welcome. We talk about all manner of dorkly things here, so whether it's sci-fi, fantasy, superheroes, we probably have a playlist about it. Feel free to check us out. Today is another in our Dork Lord of the Rings segments. And today's topic actually comes to us from a commenter, that commenter being Miss Junie B. Films. So, Miss Junie wanted to know which author would be best to complete the Lord of the Rings sequel that Tolkien started, never finished. I've actually done a video describing that sequel. It's called The New Shadow. And check it out in my Lord of the Rings playlist. I think the video references Baragond and the Lord of the Rings sequel. So I'll cover it again a little bit just to give you the flavor of what this book might be. But if you want really an in-depth analysis of the Lord of the Rings sequel as it stands, check out that video. Okay, so Miss Junie B. Films actually had a thought of her own. She thought that George R. R. Martin might be a really good author to complete this work. Now, also I should just point out the work is barely started, right? Tolkien basically wrote a scene, less than 20 pages of this thing, but you get a flavor of what's coming in that book. So, great idea, George R. R. Martin. For one thing, he is a huge Tolkien fan and used Tolkien for inspiration. I found a quote from him about Tolkien that I thought was relevant to this discussion. This is George R. R. Martin talking about Tolkien. When I started writing Game of Thrones, one of the things I did was look at Lord of the Rings and see what Tolkien did and tried to take some lessons from it. A big lesson was his handling of magic. I think a lot of epic fantasy has too much magic, but Middle-earth is suffused with a sense of magic. It's always on the peripheral, and it's used to set the stage. Gandalf is a wizard, but when orcs attack, he draws a sword and fights them. He doesn't just magically disappear them away, like what happens in so many other stories. So you can see there's an affinity for Tolkien, and Martin certainly could fit into that style. I would say, obviously Martin is a little grittier, a little more kind of a hard R in his writing than Tolkien was, but he could probably adapt. I suppose my one concern with maybe having Martin finish this is that he hasn't finished his own series yet, and has, there's been a number of years here where he hasn't completed Game of Thrones, and I just wonder if he's got the momentum that can successfully, finish the project. But as far as, a skilled author that could take the mantle and finish off and create a really cool work, obviously Martin would be a good selection. If you out there have an idea for an author that would be best suited to complete the Lord of the Rings sequel, put it down in the comments. I'll give you a few options of my own here. Actually, I asked my wife this question. She mentioned Alison Weir. She writes historical novels, specifically, usually around the Tudor period of England. So obviously well-versed in royalty, medieval history, and is also a very talented author. I also thought of one of my favorite authors, Michael Moorcock. He's got the Eternal Champion mythos. The Elric saga was one of my favorites growing up. And he's got, just these amazing worlds that he's very committed to. And he's good at creating an entirely new world and populating it with really interesting folks. But when I actually looked him up just to see, is he still around? He is still around. And he actually met Tolkien as a teenager. But unfortunately, when I was reading up on his thoughts on Tolkien, he wasn't so fond of Lord of the Rings. I think he equated it to Winnie the Pooh at one point. And I'm like, oh man, come on now. So in any case, maybe he's not the best to take on a mantle of something like that because he maybe isn't as passionate about the work. Then I thought about Terry Brooks. Terry Brooks obviously had the Shannara series, so another well-realized epic fantasy series that he completed. Some might say he borrowed maybe a little too much from Tolkien. But he also has a strong affinity for Tolkien. And I found a quote from him where he said, I think I can safely assert that virtually every writer of fantasy working in the field today who began writing after the publication of the Rings trilogy owes a debt to Tolkien. He may not have invented the form, but he provided it with its most important model in modern times, and every writer is aware of its various components. So again, somebody who could competently complete this, and somebody who has a reputation for writing, big sprawling epic fantasy in the genre. However, if you were to pin me down on who's the guy who should write this thing and who's the best suited, it's fitting because I just did a video where I was just talking about this guy because he's currently the showrunner for the adaptation of a book he helped write, Good Omens, that he wrote with Terry Pratchett. Of course, I'm talking about Neil Gaiman, who, there's so many reasons why he would be perfect for this. He is well versed in mythology, not just European mythology, but kind of world mythology. He specializes in it. He loves, the medieval genre, fantasy genre, fairy tales. These are all things that he is really, really passionate about, and he's such a talented author. And as I found out, as I read up on him, he is just a rabid devotee of Tolkien. And he describes this really cool thing. I'll read to you. This is him, age 13. He found in his school library, it had the Lord of the Rings. And so he was reading Lord of the Rings and was so amazed by it. And this is 13-year-old Neil Gaiman thinking about Lord of the Rings. It's kind of funny. Okay. I came to the conclusion that Lord of the Rings was, most probably, the best book that could ever be written, which put me in something of a quandary. I wanted to be a writer when I grew up. That's not true. I wanted to be a writer then. And I wanted to write The Lord of the Rings. The problem was, it had already been written. I gave the matter a great deal of thought and eventually came to the conclusion that the best thing would be, while holding a copy of Lord of the Rings, I slipped into a parallel universe in which Professor Tolkien had not existed. Then I'd get someone to retype the book. I knew that if I sent a publisher a book that had already been published, even in a parallel universe, they'd get suspicious. Just as I knew my own 13-year-old typing skills were not going to be up to the job of typing it. Once the book was published, I would, in this parallel universe, be the author of Lord of the Rings, than which there can be no better thing. And I read Lord of the Rings until I no longer needed to read it any longer because it was inside me. Years later, I dropped Christopher Tolkien a letter explaining something that he found himself unable to footnote and was profoundly gratified to find myself thanked in the Tolkien book, The War of the Ring. So there you go. He's just crying out to write this Lord of the Rings sequel, practically. He's obviously a huge devotee. He even communicated with Christopher Tolkien, got a little thank you in the War of the Ring book. Anyway, I think this guy, if you approached him the right way and you said, what we'd really like is this Lord of the Rings sequel to be finished by Neil Gaiman, he'd be the guy to finish it. Anyway, there you go. That's my thought on this. So what I will do is also, just because, what the heck, I'm going to give my fanfic version of of a plot to the Lord of the Rings sequel, The New Shadow. So here you go. First, I'm going to start with a quote from Tolkien. So Tolkien wrote this scene, essentially, involving characters Borlus and Ceylon. And then he wrote this letter where he's basically saying, yeah, and I'm not going to finish this thing. And so this is what he wrote to kind of describe what he was thinking about. He says, I did begin a story placed about 100 years after the downfall, but it proved both sinister and depressing. Since we're dealing with men, it is inevitable that we should be concerned with the most regrettable feature of their nature, their quick satiety with good. So that the people of Gondor in times of peace, justice, and prosperity would become discontented and restless, while the dynasts descended from Aragorn would become just kings and governors, like Denethor, or worse. I found that even so early, there was an outcrop of revolutionary plots about a center of secret Satanistic religion. I could have written a thriller, he puts it in quotes, about the plot and its discovery and overthrow, but it would have been just that, not worth doing. Okay, so that's how he kind of dismisses it. It's like, okay, there's this plot, there's this thing called the Dark Tree. It's a cult, and it's run by a character named Harrimore. And Harrimore, we know, is a name that dates back to a black Numenorian, one of the Numenorians that was worshiping Sauron back in the Second Age. And so this Dark Tree, the name of this thing, obviously, we got the White Tree, Gondor, so the Dark Tree is, I think, maybe a reaction to that. And we know that they have meetings because this guy Ceylon is inviting Borlus to come to his cult meeting, essentially. And they're in Minas Tirith. We also know that ships have been disappearing on the Anduin of late, and we know that Aragorn's son, Eldarion, is currently king. Aragorn has passed away. It's 100 years after Aragorn passed away and Arwen passed away. So most of the characters from The Lord of the Rings have passed on at this point. And we're pretty much, this sequel takes place, it's basically the year 220 of the Fourth Age. Okay, Aragorn dies in 120 of the Fourth Age. And so this is about up to the length of where Tolkien leaves off in the appendices, right? So in the appendices of Return of the King, Tolkien writes some Fourth Age stuff. Hey, here's some events of the Fourth Age, blah, 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 blah. But by the time he gets to the year 220 of the Fourth Age, it's really sparse. There's not a whole lot going on. For instance, we don't even know if Eldarion has a kid or not. Is there another heir to the throne? I would guess so, but it's not explicitly stated. One thing that is mentioned is that this is about the time that Eldarion's reign comes to a conclusion. And I can only guess it would come to an end because he died. So I think the death of Eldarion takes place in this story, in the New Shadow. Whether by natural means or not. He would be an older guy. He'd be around 200 years old, which is about the age that Aragorn passed away. So maybe it's, old age catches up to the guy. But I think that adds to this air of intrigue. So okay, so here we go. I'm throwing you my pitch. Borlus is Baragond's son. Now, Baragond, I did in that video when I talked about the New Shadow, I talk a lot about Baragond. But Baragond was a fairly minor character in Lord of the Rings. He was on the city guard, and he's the one that saved Faramir's life. Denethor is going to burn Faramir alive. Baragond actually kills some of the other guards of the city, holds off Denethor so that he can't kill his son, and then he's on guard to guard Faramir while he's nursing back to health. As a result, at the end of the war, although he committed treason and killed his fellow guards, Aragorn, because he realizes he did it out of love for Faramir, basically can't let him go unpunished, but banishes him. He can't ever hang out in Minas Tirith again, and so he is basically like a captain of the guard, an honorary position with Faramir. Faramir goes and becomes Prince of Ithilien and lives in Ithilien, and Baragond is there with him. So in other words, he's kind of, thanks, but don't come back. So he leaves Gondor. He goes into Ithilien. His son Borlus, obviously over time, has gone and lived in Minas Tirith anyway. So that's kind of interesting. I mean, Borlus must have grown up in Ithilien, but at some point decided to move back to Minas Tirith. So at this point, Borlus is an old man. His son, he has a son, Baralach. And Baralach, when he was a kid, would hang out with this kid, Ceylon. Ceylon does a lot of talking in this scene that Tolkien writes. Ceylon is kind of was a ne'er-do-well kid, stole fruit from Borlus's orchard back in the day, and is kind of seems kind of a creepy guy now. And so Ceylon has approached Borlis at Borlis's house and is talking to him. Just like, hey, remember the old times when I used to hang out with your son? And they get to talking on evil and this dark tree and, this figure named Harrimore. And so Ceylon's like, oh, you seem to know a lot about this already, but, hey, if you want to know more, why don't you meet me, like at midnight tonight, and I'll take you to, just follow me, and I'll let you'll find out more. So that's essentially what we know about this plot line. So my thought is, if you remember in the quote from Tolkien, when he says, what is it? Since we are dealing with men, it is inevitable we should be concerned with the most regrettable feature of their nature, their quick satiety with good. So the people of Gondor are getting discontented and restless. Okay, so I really feel like, especially since the age of magic, if you want to call it that, is passing on, right? Most, if not all, the elves have left by this point. A lot of the dwarves have now gone underground. I know Gimli has left. He had started up a colony in the Glittering Caves over by Helm's Deep. That colony's probably still got dwarves in it, but he himself left Middle-earth a long time ago. Moria still got some dwarves in it, but again, I think they're probably isolated. Humans are kind of left to their own devices, and so I think this is a human story, not a magical creature story. You got Radagast out there somewhere, probably. You've probably got the Blue Wizards out there somewhere. But I don't think they're really a part of this story. I think this is a human drama. So, Borlis, if you're going to set up the idea of going to a cult meeting, you kind of have to do that. So Borlis goes to the cult meeting, is just out of some kind of interest and morbid curiosity, attends some underground meeting. I can imagine him getting like a black cloak and like hanging out with oh, okay, great. Realizes how many people are involved. Maybe it's a bunch of folks. I can imagine this, hall that's like maybe an underground area that's just packed with people listening to some orator. Perhaps it's actually this leader, Harrimore, and he's masked or something, and he's giving this basically kind of like it almost be like neo-Nazis where they're like, remember the good old days when Sauron was leading up things? If you remember, it's Sauron who, even when he was captured by the Númenóreans, he's like, hey guys, Morgoth is this really amazing god, and if you can, if you just sacrifice some folks to him and, worship him in the right way, he'll give you, immortality and stuff. And so they were all in on that kind of stuff. So I can imagine it's something like that where it's like, maybe it's hey, maybe it's even Morgoth again, this creature. Sure, they defeated Sauron, but the ultimate master of creation is Morgoth, and he's up in the void, and he'll hear your unholy prayers. I don't know, perhaps something like that. But I feel like in this moment, perhaps Borlis, who seems like he's going to be our everyman, our what's going on here? He's also a remnant of the older times, right? So he's a carryover. He remembers what it was like. 'Cause now 100 years since Aragorn's death, even over 200 years since the War of the Ring, people are forgetting about elves. People are forgetting about magic. People are forgetting about what the war was about. Generations have passed. These aren't all Númenóreans, so humanity, you're lucky to live to 100. So a few generations have passed, and so people have forgotten about this stuff. And so Borlis would be one of the few, perhaps, who does remember all these things. And so I feel like perhaps he gets detained at this meeting, maybe questioned, and it becomes apparent that he was brought there maybe for a reason. And he's being questioned perhaps about his son, because Baralach, his son, is in the high command of essentially the Royal Navy, Eldarian's navy. He is in Pelargir in the south, and he's out at sea most of the time. But he is definitely, whatever. I don't know if he's a general, but let's say he's a higher up admiral in the Queen's Navy. And so, since we do know that ships are disappearing on the Anduin, I feel like maybe we could bring in Borlus's son in this way, because his son is going to be patrolling the Anduin and the sea, and so maybe Borlus is being asked about his higher up son, and is either going to be held hostage or interrogated in some way and escapes. They'll say he escapes in some way, perhaps is aided in escape by somebody, and goes to confide to his son, like, oh, my son's in danger, I should go warn him. And so maybe journeys to find his son or sends him a message. I think the little reveal, perhaps, because we know Baralak as a kid was hanging out with this Ceylon guy. That's how Ceylon is connected to Borlus. I think maybe the big reveal would be that Baralak is actually a member of the Dark Tree as well, and that the Navy has been subjugated to take on, he's like a pirate essentially, going around raiding ships to get material goods to support this cult that is now spreading around the country. Borlus, again, perhaps Baralak can't kill off his dad, even though now his dad knows too much of the plot, perhaps. And so Borlus manages to escape that situation. Eldarion, meanwhile, passes away, and maybe there's a hint that it was foul play. And there's perhaps the cult starts up some kind of a blockade, and they're gonna whatever the line of succession is. Let's say Eldarion has a son. Perhaps that son is too young at this point, and there's oh my gosh, there's a real question as to who's going to rule over Gondor and Arnor again. But I think in the end result, there would almost have to be an heir of Elendil that would sit on the throne, because it just feels weird if Tolkien had this whole thing of thousands of years went by where we didn't have an heir, and then Aragorn showed up and everything was right. For about 200 years, and then it all went to hell again. So I feel like the end result would be that he wouldn't just give up on the legacy of Elendil that quickly. It wouldn't just be a 200 years and now we're done with it. So I feel like inevitably the end result would be that through whatever circumstances happen, Eldarion's child becomes king or queen, perhaps, of Gondor again. So perhaps to facilitate that, since Borlus grew up in Ithilien, and obviously he had to have known Faramir maybe before Faramir had passed away, and Faramir's child, he goes to Ithilien for help, and specifically the current prince of Ithilien, who would almost certainly be Faramir's grandson, Barahir. So Barahir probably knows Borlus, and Borlus could even get a one-on-one counsel with him and say, look, there's this cult, it's the Dark Tree, it's spreading, they're threatening to take over Minas Tirith, and I know if my son is part of it, I know some folks who are part of this thing, you need to rally and defend the realm, or else the realm's going to fall to this cult. And so perhaps inevitably Ithilien, it would be kind of fitting because it was Faramir, if you remember, who ultimately was what allowed the peaceful transition of power. Faramir, as a steward, could have denied Aragorn the right to rule Gondor, and probably would have been a war over it. But he realizes that Aragorn is the rightful ruler, and so allows for this peaceful transition. So it's Faramir that enables Aragorn to take over in the way that he does. So it would be kind of fitting that the grandson of Faramir helps the grandkid of Aragorn, kind of maintain the throne of Gondor and Arnor. And so perhaps at the end result, it's Borlus and this the Prince of Ithilien, Barahir, that are able to thwart Baralak and the Dark Tree. And I'll say this: I'll just go with Harrimore, this mysterious Harrimore. I would go with he is the son of the Mouth of Sauron. So the Mouth of Sauron, a black Númenórean, who was roughly the same age as Aragorn. So it would be kind of interesting if his kid was, squaring off against Aragorn's kid in a way, right? So there you go. The Black Númenórean, the Mouth of Sauron, his kid probably grew up resenting. I was like his dad went away at some point to be Sauron's lieutenant. We know that over time, Mouth of Sauron even forgot his own name. But at some point, he knew his name, and he was, he could have had a family and a house because he was an adult when he went off to join Sauron. So perhaps that son, honors that legacy, kind of like a Kylo Ren honoring Darth Vader kind of thing. And maybe even Baralach is willing to not honor his vow to protect Gondor, because maybe he even blames Gondor a little bit for their treatment of his granddad, right? His Baragond, did what he thought was right, saved Faramir's life, and for it he got banished from the kingdom. So maybe he's like, well, you know what? I'm going to do the right thing as well, and I'm going to overthrow these pesky line of Elendil. I don't know, perhaps. Anyway, there you go. That's my fanfic. That was complete fanfic there, by the way. So hope you enjoyed it. But if you've got some ideas for the ending for the Lord of the Rings sequel, put it in the comments. Be happy to hear it. And also, obviously, if you've got an idea for an author to write the Lord of the Rings sequel, basically finish, he'd have to write most of the book. Put it in the comments. Miss Junie B Films would love to hear your thoughts. Just before I go here, producer Steve, who, by the way, has never read, I think, a single word of Lord of the Rings, weighed in on his fanfic for the ending of the Lord of the Rings sequel, and I give that to you as we go out. So bye, everybody. Feel free to subscribe and make any kind of comments you want. Bye now. Take it away, producer Steve.
Little disclaimer, I don't know anything about Lord of the Rings, except there were elves looking for a ring, and they had to put it in a volcano. What were the names of the riders when you put the ring on? It summoned them.
There was a Nazgul.
And how many of them were there?
There were 9.
Okay, so what if there were more? What if there was a region of them, and it talks about how the region was dispersed and maybe destroyed, or they've gone off to other worlds or dimensions. Now they're coming back to reunite, and there's like hundreds of them, right? And the ring was just, you thought it was bad with those guys, but now there's like 782. Chaos ensues. You would think they're going to be the strongest. Nope. Human race survives. Enter Dark Ages, Middle Ages, whatever. King Arthur times, and then later on the Wright brothers.
Then Daggerath, the Wright brothers fly in, start shooting at Satan. All right. I like it. Yeah.
Yeah.